On March 30th, 1945, the highest-ranking American officer to die by enemy fire in Europe made a decision that would cost him his life. He chose to lead from the front in a lightly armored jeep, racing ahead of his reconnaissance units through enemy territory, pushing his division forward in the longest single-day armored advance of the entire war. Within hours, he would be dead on a forest road in Germany, shot at point-blank range while surrendering with his hands raised. His name was Major General Maurice Rose, and this is the story of how the man who refused to command from safety became a legend, a cautionary tale, and a ghost that still haunts the question every leader must answer. How close to danger is too close? The 3rd Armored Division did not walk into Germany. It roared. It crashed through the Siegfried line like a fist through rotted wood, and at the head of that fist stood a man who believed that speed was survival, that hesitation was death, and that a general's place was not behind a desk but in the dust and smoke where his soldiers bled. Maurice Rose commanded from the front because he could not imagine commanding any other way. He was 51 years old in the spring of 1945, a career officer who had risen through the ranks not by politics or connections, but by an almost reckless commitment to being wherever the fighting was hardest. His men called him the general who leads, and they meant it as both praise and warning. Rose did not look like a Hollywood version of a warrior. He was compact, unsmiling, intense. His face carried the weight of every decision he had made since North Africa, every tank crew that had burned, every soldier who had not come home. He spoke rarely and without warmth. He demanded absolute discipline and absolute courage, and he gave both in return. His philosophy of command was brutally simple. Stay moving, stay aggressive, never let the enemy consolidate, never let your men think retreat is an option. He believed that a general who asked his soldiers to take risks while remaining safe himself was not a leader but a coward. And so he rode forward again and again into situations where a single sniper or a single shell could end him. His staff officers pleaded with him to stay back. He ignored them. His superiors warned him that his death would cripple morale. He did not care. Or perhaps he cared too much about something else, something harder to name. Perhaps he believed that leadership was a debt paid in proximity to death. Maurice Rose had not always been destined for command. He was born in Connecticut in 1899, the son of a rabbi, raised in a tradition that valued learning and compassion over violence. But the First World War pulled him into uniform when he was barely old enough to shave. He served as an infantry officer in France, saw the trenches, saw what artillery did to human bodies, and came home with something broken inside that never quite healed. He stayed in the army between the wars, one of thousands of officers marking time in a military that nobody wanted and nobody funded. He studied armor tactics when America had almost no tanks. He practiced maneuvers with wooden vehicles and imaginary enemies. He waited. When the Second World War began, Rose was already in his 40s, old for combat command, but the Army needed experienced officers desperately. They gave him tanks, and he proved he knew how to use them. In North Africa, Rose served under Patton and learned the gospel of armored warfare according to a man who treated tanks like cavalry and aggression like a virtue. Patton taught that armor should never stop, never dig in, never give the enemy time to think. Rose absorbed those lessons and made them his own, stripping away Patton's theatricality but keeping the core doctrine: speed kills, hesitation dies. When Rose was given command of Combat Command A of the 2nd Armored Division, he immediately began molding his officers to think like him. He fired commanders who were too cautious. He promoted men who took risks. He made it clear that under his command there would be no defensive positions, no holding actions, no waiting for orders. There would only be advance. By the time Rose took command of the 3rd Armored Division in the summer of 1944, he had already earned a reputation as a hard man who got results. The 3rd Armored was a powerful formation, with 3 tank battalions and supporting infantry, engineers, and artillery. It was designed to punch through enemy lines and exploit breakthroughs, to move fast and hit hard. Under Rose's command, it became something more, a blunt instrument wielded by a man who believed that mercy meant ending the war as quickly as possible, regardless of cost. His division became known for its speed, its aggression, and its casualties. Rose did not apologize for any of it. The 3rd Armored Division was Rose's instrument, and he played it like a weapon. It was not the largest American armored division, but under his command, it became one of the most feared. The division had cut through France in the summer of 1944, racing across open ground, bypassing German strongpoints, striking deep into rear areas before the enemy could react. Rose had learned his trade under Patton, and he shared Patton's obsession with speed and audacity, but where Patton was theatrical and loud, Rose was silent and cold. He did not need to shout. His presence was enough. When he arrived at the front, his tankers knew that rest was over, that the advance would resume, that there would be no excuses and no delays. They hated him sometimes. They respected him always. They followed him because he never sent them anywhere he would not go himself. But the march across France had been paid for in blood and steel. The Sherman tank, backbone of American armored forces, was a death trap against German heavy armor. The German 88mm anti-tank gun could punch through a Sherman's frontal armor at ranges where the Sherman's 75mm gun was useless. Rose knew this. Every tanker knew this. They climbed into their Shermans anyway because Rose demanded it, and because stopping meant dying slower. The 3rd Armored had lost hundreds of tanks crossing France. Crews burned alive inside their vehicles, trapped as ammunition exploded and metal turned molten. The tankers called their Shermans Ronsons, after the cigarette lighter, because they lit up so easily. They painted grim jokes on their turrets and prayed to gods they had stopped believing in, and they followed Rose forward because he was always in front, always visible, always in range of the same guns that killed them. Rose watched it happen again and again, and he did not flinch. He could not afford to flinch. He demanded that his tankers keep moving forward, that they flank the German positions, that they use speed and numbers to overwhelm firepower. It worked. It also killed men. Rose carried those deaths with him, a weight that never lightened, only grew heavier. His staff officers noticed that he spoke less as the campaign went on, that his face became harder, that he seemed to be retreating into some private place where the dead could not follow. But he never retreated from the front. If anything, he moved closer to danger, as if he were daring the war to take him, to balance the scales. By September 1944, the 3rd Armored had driven deeper into Germany than any other Allied division. They were the first American armored unit to cross the German border, the first to breach the Siegfried line, that belt of concrete and steel that was supposed to make the Reich invincible. The Siegfried line was not a single wall but a network of bunkers, dragon's teeth anti-tank obstacles, minefields, and interlocking fields of fire. German propaganda had claimed it was impregnable. Rose proved otherwise. He sent his tanks forward in waves, accepting losses, grinding through obstacles, using artillery and airstrikes to suppress German fire. His infantry followed the tanks, clearing bunkers with grenades and flamethrowers, taking casualties with every yard gained. The breakthrough took days and cost hundreds of men, but Rose would not stop. He pushed until the line broke, until his tanks were rolling through German villages that had never expected to see American soldiers, until the myth of German invincibility shattered like glass. Rose had brought them there by refusing to let his division rest, by pushing commanders who wanted to consolidate, by driving forward even when supply lines stretched thin and exhaustion became a weapon as dangerous as German guns. His soldiers stumbled through the Siegfried line half dead from fatigue, and they broke through because Rose would not accept failure. The breakthrough did not end the war. It barely slowed the German resistance, but it proved that Germany could be invaded, that the Siegfried line was a myth, and that Maurice Rose would not stop until someone made him stop. Then came the Bulge. In December 1944, the Germans launched their last great offensive in the West, a desperate gamble to split the Allied armies and reach the port of Antwerp. Hitler had scraped together his last reserves, his final panzer divisions, and thrown them west through the Ardennes forest in a surprise attack that caught the Americans completely unprepared. Entire regiments were surrounded and destroyed. Panic spread through the American lines. The weather was terrible, snow and fog grounding Allied aircraft, giving the Germans freedom to maneuver. For a few days, it looked like the German offensive might actually succeed, that the war might drag on for months or even years more. The 3rd Armored Division was rushed north to help stop the German drive toward the Meuse River. Rose arrived in chaos. American units were retreating, confused, scattered. German panzer columns were pushing west through snow and fog, and the situation was desperate. Commanders were asking for permission to withdraw, to establish defensive lines farther back, to regroup before counterattacking. Rose refused. He did what he always did. He attacked. He threw his division into the German flank, disrupting their advance, buying time for other American units to regroup. The fighting was savage. Tanks dueled at close range in frozen forests where visibility was measured in yards. Infantry fought house to house in villages that changed hands multiple times in a single day, leaving streets littered with frozen corpses that nobody had time to bury. Rose was everywhere, moving from unit to unit in his jeep, ignoring German artillery, demanding counterattacks, refusing to yield ground. His tankers were exhausted, their vehicles breaking down from constant use in sub-zero temperatures, but Rose would not let them rest. He appeared at command posts in the middle of the night, demanded status reports, issued orders, and disappeared back into the darkness. His presence steadied the line. Officers who were contemplating retreat decided to hold. Soldiers who were ready to break found something inside themselves because Rose was there, because if the general was not afraid, then maybe they did not need to be either. The German offensive stalled, then broke. The 3rd Armored had helped save the Meuse, but the cost had been brutal. More tanks destroyed, more men lost, more names added to the list Rose carried in his mind. By March 1945, the war was ending, but the dying had not stopped. The Allies had crossed the Rhine and Germany was collapsing, but collapse did not mean surrender. German soldiers kept fighting, sometimes out of loyalty, sometimes out of fear of what would happen if they stopped, sometimes simply because nobody had told them they were allowed to quit. The 3rd Armored crossed the Rhine and plunged into the heart of Germany. Rose led them into Cologne, the great cathedral city on the river's west bank. The city was a ruin, shattered by bombing and artillery, but German soldiers still fought from the rubble. Snipers killed Americans from church towers. Machine gun nests turned intersections into killing zones. The cathedral itself, miraculously still standing amid total destruction, became a navigation point for both sides. Rose entered Cologne while the battle was still raging. He stood in the open, exposed to sniper fire, observing the fighting through binoculars. His staff officers shouted at him to take cover. He ignored them. He needed to see the city to understand the terrain, to make decisions based on what his eyes told him, not what maps showed. He watched his tanks fight through streets choked with rubble, watched infantry clear buildings floor by floor, watched the city die around him. A sniper's bullet could have killed him that day. Dozens of Americans were shot by snipers in Cologne, officers and enlisted men alike. Rose stood in the open for hours and was never hit. It did not feel like luck. It felt like something else, like the war was saving him for a different end. His staff officers shouted at him to take cover. He ignored them. A sniper's bullet could have killed him that day. It did not. Rose walked away untouched and his division captured Cologne, but his luck, if it was luck, was running thin. The crossing of the Rhine opened Germany to invasion, and the Allied High Command saw an opportunity to end the war quickly. The plan was to encircle the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland, trapping hundreds of thousands of German soldiers and destroying their ability to resist. The Ruhr was where Germany made its steel, its coal, its weapons. Without it, the German war machine would die. To close the encirclement, American forces needed to push east and link up with other units driving from the south. The mission fell to the 3rd Armored. Rose was ordered to advance nearly 100 miles through enemy territory, to seize the town of Paderborn, and to seal the pocket. It was an audacious mission, risky, possibly suicidal. The route passed through territory that was supposedly collapsing but still full of German soldiers who might fight or might surrender depending on factors nobody could predict. Rose accepted the mission without hesitation. This was what he had trained for, what his entire philosophy of warfare demanded: speed, aggression, no second guessing. On March 25, 1945, the 3rd Armored Division began its final sprint. Rose pushed his tankers forward at a pace that stunned even veteran commanders. The division moved day and night, bypassing German strongpoints, racing through villages before defenders could organize, leaving rearguard units to mop up resistance. It was blitzkrieg in reverse, an American armored thrust deep into the collapsing Reich. The Germans could not stop them because they could not predict where Rose would strike next. His columns moved faster than intelligence reports, faster than orders could be issued, faster than reinforcements could arrive. Rose was in his element, riding in his command vehicle at the front of the advance, making decisions in seconds that other commanders would have agonized over for hours. Go left, bypass that town, push through, keep moving, do not stop, do not think, just move. In a single day, the 3rd Armored advanced over 90 miles, the longest single-day advance by any Allied division during the entire war. It was a masterpiece of armored warfare, a vindication of Rose's philosophy of speed and aggression. It was also the beginning of the end. The German commanders in the Ruhr were not fools. They understood what Rose was trying to do, and they understood that if he succeeded, the war in the West was over. The 116th Panzer Division, a veteran unit that had fought across Russia and France, was ordered to stop the American advance at any cost. The Germans had few tanks left, but what they had were the heavy Tigers and Panthers that could destroy Shermans with ease. On the night of March 29th, the 116th Panzer Division regrouped and prepared a defense. They chose their ground carefully, narrow forest roads where American tanks could not maneuver, where ambushes would be devastating. They positioned their Tigers and their anti-tank guns and their infantry, and they waited for Maurice Rose to come to them. Rose did not know the Germans were waiting. His intelligence reports suggested scattered resistance, disorganized retreat. He believed the road to Paderborn was open, that the Germans were broken, that one more push would finish them. He was wrong. On the morning of March 30th, he made a decision that would define his legacy and end his life. He decided to lead a reconnaissance mission himself. He would take a small convoy, push forward ahead of the main force, and scout the route to Paderborn. His staff officers objected. This was work for reconnaissance units, not for the division commander. Major Robert Bellinger, his operations officer, argued with him directly. Colonel Walter Richardson, commander of one of his tank battalions, told him it was unnecessary risk. Rose overruled them all. He needed to see the ground himself. He needed to know if the advance could continue. He could not wait for reports. He climbed into his jeep, a lightly armored vehicle with no protection against anything heavier than small arms fire, and ordered the convoy forward. The convoy consisted of Rose's jeep, a command half-track, a few other vehicles, and a single Sherman tank in the lead. It was a small force, vulnerable, exposed. Rose rode in the second vehicle, close enough to see everything, close enough to be hit by anything. The convoy moved east along a narrow road through dense forest. The trees pressed close on both sides, limiting visibility, turning the road into a tunnel. It was perfect ambush terrain, and Rose must have known it, but he did not turn back. He pushed forward because that was what he always did. Because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering all the men who had died following his orders, and Rose could not afford to remember. He could only move forward. The Germans were waiting just ahead. They had positioned a Tiger tank across the road, blocking it completely. The Tiger was a monster, 56 tons of armor and firepower, nearly invincible from the front. Behind the Tiger, hidden in the trees, were infantry with Panzerfaust anti-tank rockets and machine guns. The trap was set perfectly. When the lead Sherman rounded a bend in the road, the Tiger fired. The Sherman exploded, a fireball of metal and burning fuel that turned the narrow road into an inferno. The road was blocked. The convoy stopped. Chaos erupted. Rose ordered his driver to reverse to escape the ambush, but there was no room to turn around. The forest pressed too close, the road too narrow. The jeep backed up desperately, tires spinning on muddy ground, trying to find space, trying to find an exit. German soldiers appeared from the trees, shouting in German, weapons raised. The convoy was surrounded. There was no way out. No way forward, no way back, just German guns and German soldiers closing in from all sides. Rose understood immediately that he was trapped. He could order his men to fight, but they would die. The Germans had the advantage, the firepower, the position. His jeep had a mounted machine gun, but nothing that could hurt a Tiger. His men had rifles and pistols. Against German infantry in prepared positions, they had no chance. Surrender was the only option that would save lives. It went against everything Rose believed, everything he had taught his soldiers about never giving up, never backing down. But he was not going to get his men killed in a pointless last stand. He climbed out of his jeep with his hands raised. His staff officers followed, hands up, unarmed. The German soldiers moved forward, rifles aimed, shouting orders that the Americans could not understand. The situation was tense but controlled. This was a surrender, not an execution. Soldiers on both sides were professionals who understood the rules. Then the Tiger tank commander appeared. He was young, probably in his early 20s, exhausted from weeks of retreat and desperate fighting. His uniform was dirty, his face gaunt. He climbed down from his tank and walked toward the group of American prisoners, trying to understand what he had caught. He saw Rose standing beside the jeep, hands raised, an American general in full uniform with stars on his helmet and insignia on his shoulders. He saw the highest-ranking American officer he would ever capture, possibly the highest-ranking American any German soldier in the Ruhr would capture. For a moment, it must have seemed like a victory, something to report, something to be proud of. Then Rose reached toward his sidearm. He was following standard military protocol. Officers surrendering were expected to unbuckle their sidearms and hand them over to their captors. It was a gesture of respect, a formality that acknowledged defeat and transfer of authority. Rose had probably surrendered prisoners himself and knew the drill. He reached for his pistol belt to remove his weapon and offer it to the German commander. It was the correct thing to do, the professional thing to do, the thing that any trained officer would have done in that situation. The German tank commander did not see protocol. He saw an American general reaching for a gun. He saw a threat. He was 20 years old and terrified and had watched his country collapse around him for months. He had seen friends die, cities burn, the Reich that was supposed to last 1,000 years crumble in 5. He was exhausted and scared, and when he saw Rose reach for his pistol, he panicked. His hand went to his machine pistol and he fired. The burst of machine gun fire hit Rose at point-blank range, multiple rounds striking his chest and head. He was dead before he hit the ground, killed instantly, no final words, no dramatic collapse, just alive 1 second and gone the next. His staff officers froze, horrified. The German soldiers froze, equally horrified. Nobody had expected this. The tank commander stared at the body, realizing what he had done, realizing that he had just killed a surrendering officer, that this was not combat but something else, something uglier. The other German soldiers backed away from him, their faces showing shock and disgust. This was not how soldiers behaved. This was not what they had been trained to do. But it was done, and Rose was dead, and nothing could change it. The ambush ended. The Germans took the surviving Americans prisoner and disappeared into the forest. They left Rose's body where it fell, beside his jeep on a dirt road in Germany. Other American units found him later that day when they pushed through the ambush site. They covered him with a blanket and carried him away. Maurice Rose lay dead on a dirt road in Germany 3 weeks before the war ended. The news of Rose's death spread through the 3rd Armored Division like a shockwave. Soldiers who had cursed his name for pushing them too hard wept when they heard. Officers who had argued with him about tactics felt something break inside. The division had lost commanders before, but Rose was different. He was the core, the driving force, the reason they had come so far so fast. His death felt personal, a wound that went deeper than casualty lists or combat losses. For a few hours the advance stopped. The 3rd Armored sat motionless, stunned, unsure if they could continue without the man who had never let them stop. But the war did not stop. Rose's second-in-command, Brigadier General Doyle Hickey, assumed control and made a choice. He ordered the division to continue the advance. It was what Rose would have wanted. It was what Rose had died trying to achieve. The 3rd Armored resumed its sprint toward Paderborn. They reached the town on April 1st, 2 days after Rose's death. They seized it against fierce German resistance, pushing through streets, clearing buildings, accepting casualties because Rose had taught them that momentum was everything. The encirclement of the Ruhr was complete. Approximately 376,000 German soldiers were trapped inside the pocket, the largest mass surrender in the European theater. The pocket was officially named the Ruhr Pocket, in honor of the general who had died closing it. It was a victory, absolute and overwhelming. It did not feel like one. The United States Army launched an immediate investigation into Rose's death. The circumstances were murky, the accounts conflicted. Some witnesses claimed Rose was shot while trying to escape. Others insisted he was surrendering. The German tank commander, if he survived the war, was never identified or brought to trial. The investigation examined the physical evidence, interviewed survivors, tried to reconstruct the final seconds of Rose's life. The official conclusion was that Rose's death was a tragic misunderstanding, not a war crime. The German soldier had misinterpreted Rose's gesture and fired in a moment of panic and confusion. It was the fog of war, the chaos of combat, the terrible randomness that kills men regardless of rank or intention. The investigation closed. The war ended. Maurice Rose was buried with full military honors. But the questions did not end. Rose became a ghost that haunted military academies and staff colleges, a case study in leadership and risk, a man whose decisions saved thousands of lives and cost him his own. Historians argued about him for decades. Some said his aggressive command style shortened the war, that his refusal to slow down kept pressure on the Germans and prevented them from regrouping, that his death was the price of victory. Others said he took unnecessary risks, that a division commander had no business leading reconnaissance missions, that his presence at the front was ego and stubbornness, not courage. Both sides had evidence. Both sides were probably right. What cannot be argued is that Maurice Rose led from the front when leading from the front meant dying. He demanded that his soldiers take risks, and he took greater risks himself. He believed that a general who stayed safe while his men fought was not worthy of command, and he lived that belief until it killed him. His legacy is written in the miles his division covered, in the speed of their advance, in the German soldiers they captured, and the towns they liberated. It is also written in the faces of the men who served under him, who followed him because he never asked them to go anywhere he would not lead, who hated him and loved him and mourned him when he died. The 3rd Armored Division fought until the German surrender in May 1945. They had traveled farther and fought harder than almost any other American division in Europe. They had been first into Germany, first through the Siegfried line, instrumental in stopping the Bulge, and they had closed the Ruhr Pocket. Maurice Rose had driven them to those achievements, and he had paid for them with his life. His name is on memorials and in history books, but his real monument is the memory of the soldiers who followed him, who still argue about whether he was a hero or a fool, and who cannot imagine having followed anyone else. There is a photograph of Rose taken a few weeks before he died. He is standing beside a Sherman tank, covered in mud, face drawn with exhaustion. He is not smiling. He looks like a man carrying an enormous weight, a man who knows something terrible is coming but cannot stop moving toward it. The photograph has been analyzed by historians and psychologists, debated and dissected, but it resists easy interpretation. Perhaps Rose knew he was going to die. Perhaps he always knew. Perhaps that was the point. Perhaps he believed that leaders do not get to survive, that command is a debt paid in full, that the only way to ask men to die is to be willing to die yourself. Or perhaps he was simply a man who could not stop, who had spent so long moving forward that stopping felt like surrender, and surrender was the one thing he could not accept until a German gun forced him to his knees. On March 30th, 1945, Maurice Rose made a choice. He climbed into a jeep and drove toward danger because that was what he always did. He died with his hands raised, shot by a frightened soldier on a forest road. 3 weeks before the war he had fought for 4 years finally ended. He was 51 years old. He was the highest-ranking American officer killed by enemy fire in the European theater. He was a man who refused to command from safety and paid the price. History has not decided if that price was necessary. It has only decided that Maurice Rose paid it willingly and that the men who followed him remember. If this story made you think about leadership, about risk, about the fine line between courage and recklessness, I would ask you to subscribe to this channel and like this video. More importantly, I would ask you to leave a comment answering a question that has no easy answer. Was Maurice Rose's death the inevitable cost of his command style, or was it a preventable tragedy? Did his willingness to die alongside his soldiers inspire them to victory, or did it rob them of the leader they needed most? History gives us facts. It does not always give us answers. Perhaps you can find one where historians could not. Thank you for watching, and thank you for remembering a man who led from the front until the front killed him.